Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm Executive Director at American Compass, and I am thrilled to be joined by David Leonhardt, Senior Writer at the New York Times, author of the fantastic book, Ours Was the Shining Future, and author as well, author, something like that, of a wonderful piece in the Times over the weekend called A New Centrism is Rising in Washington, that spoke a lot about the maybe bipartisan, maybe more so cross-partisan types of deals and agreements that are emerging lately. And so we said, David, come talk with us about it. And he has agreed to. So David, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me, Oren. You and I have been talking about these ideas for a long time, so I'm excited to do so for your listeners.
Exactly. I guess maybe a strange initial question. I'm curious, what is the genesis of a piece like this? Does an editor say, hey, what the heck is going on here? Or what is the process by which its consciousness becomes raised?
That is exactly what happened here. That's not the way most of my pieces happen. Most of my pieces, I come up with an idea, I talk to some other people about it, and then I go off and write it. But several times over the last few years, one of the editors has come to me and said, hey, can you try to connect some dots for us? And so I've done one on the state of democracy in the U.S. I've done one on the state of the SAT. I guess that was probably my idea. But this was not. An editor came to me and said, I keep seeing all this bipartisan legislation, and it just doesn't fit with the story that you constantly hear people telling, the cliche of we're so polarized that we can't do anything. Can you try to explain it? And so it started with that question about bipartisanship. And how do you ultimately answer it? I mean, we have our answers here at American Compass about what's driving realignment, but what popped up most for you that seemed to be the driving force? To me, the thing that pops up is it's not random where this agreement is, right? And it's not scattered all over the map. It isn't. For the most part on our most divisive social issues, although let's put a pin in immigration, which I think is as much an economic issue as a social issue. So, it's not on gender issues. It's not on abortion, at least not at the federal level. I think where we see it is on economic policy and on foreign policy. And so to me, when you get underneath that, what you see is that there is, I don't want to call it a consensus, but there is a fair amount of agreement or at least overlap between the two parties on economic policy and foreign policy. And a fair amount of it discards, in fact, is a reaction to some of the ideas of the 1980s and 90s and early aughts, which obviously intersects with the work that you're doing at American Compass. And so what you really see is we can pick our words, whether it's industrial policy or whether it's new Cold Wars. But what you can see is part of the Republican Party and part of the Democratic Party has really come to question what was this neoliberal idea that so long as we have free markets, prosperity will follow, and so will democracy and human rights in other countries. And those predictions just haven't really borne out. And you see people on both the left and the right saying, okay, given that they haven't borne out, what should we do about it? And I think a fair amount, not all of the legislation, some of the legislation is narrower. It's on veterans' health. It's the kind of thing there's always been bipartisan agreement on, or almost always. But the most ambitious legislation, semiconductors, infrastructure, Ukraine, TikTok, the most ambitious legislation basically takes off from this point that markets alone won't necessarily deliver the results that we want.
It's interesting to me that Ukraine is in there because there's sort of, I don't know if you're a Sesame Street fan with one of these things is not like the others, but it seems to me that, and maybe it's the main foreign policy example, Ukraine seems much more like to me, like the sort of dying embers of the old consensus. That seems like exactly what everyone would have been been pushing for in the 90s or the 2000s. And a lot of the same folks who are, at least on the right of center, who are coming together in interesting ways on economic issues are exactly the ones who are most resistant on the foreign policy issues. Is that a fair separation, or do you think it is more of a piece with the others?
I think there's something fair in there. If we start with China instead, I think it's clear that concerns about China as a foreign policy threat are connected to these economic ideas. I mean, I assume you would agree that part of the reason the semiconductor bill passed was not so much about creating good paying semiconductor jobs in Ohio, but was about responding to China. And so if you think about the idea that the United States is increasingly appears to be in a global competition with a loose coalition, but nonetheless a coalition that includes China and Russia and Iran and Iran's funded groups like the Houthis and Hamas, and to some extent North Korea. I mean, you see all those entities helping each other in different ways, not on every issue, but they certainly seem to be helping each other a lot, right? There was a strange amount of anti-Israel propaganda coming from China and Russia after October 7th. Then in that way, I think it is fair to think of Ukraine as related to this fear that if the United States simply allows markets to work their magic, that we will have both prosperity and a world that looks like us. Having said that, I grant your point that there are tensions, particularly on the right, about Ukraine funding. And they often come from some of the same people who are actually quite amenable to these new economic ideas, what I called in the article neopopulism. That, J.D. Vance is both amenable to neopopulism in a whole bunch of ways. He's praised Lena Khan for her trust busting, and he's skeptical of Ukraine funding. But to me, I would think of it more as a tension, and maybe in the end it'll be a tension that hives off the new right from it. But I would think of it as a tension much as on the left, you have people who are very comfortable with industrial policy who are less comfortable with Israel. And so that's sort of how I would think about it. But I'm not going to try to argue that you're wrong. I just still think there are ways in which Ukraine both fits and doesn't fit with this larger story.
Yeah. Well, and also just in terms of diagnosis, it's a very good point you make that even the onset of the war in Ukraine and some of the effects of that certainly played into even more skepticism of globalization and the sort of, the two countries with McDonald's have never fought a war kind of narrative, I think certainly took a hit there.
Look, I think this foreign policy stuff is really important. I mean, I'm reading my colleague David Sanger's book right now, and he goes back and he recirculates the quotes. That you've probably seen this quote because it's gotten a lot of attention. But Bill Clinton telling China, "Good luck with regulating the internet. It's like stapling Jello to the wall," right? And David has a bunch of those quotes. I think it's really important to say that those predictions, which we heard from members of both parties, right, very much from both the Clinton and both Bush administrations, those predictions have just, whether they were reasonable to make at the time or not, they have turned out really, really badly. And there is no way in which the Washington consensus of neoliberalism has produced a flowering of democracy around the world. None. And that is really worth some reflection.
Yeah, I'll take this opportunity to promote one of my all-time favorite American Compass projects called Wrong All Along, which is a page that features those quotes and probably literally a couple hundred others of just all of the most ludicrous things said at the onset of globalization and with China's ascension to the WTO that certainly have not aged well. But I wanted to get to this term neopopulism, which I love and I will be using from here on out. It's interesting though, because even as you sort of described, what you see as the driving force behind some of these new areas of agreement, they were quite sort of substantive in the sense that they weren't just politically convenient or we think these are where the voters were. You start from what is really going on in the world and what needs fixing, populism is often, at least the word is thrown around to sort of suggest a total disconnect from substantive problems and a sort of lowest common denominator sort of effort to appeal to the masses in the sort of the spirit of democracy is giving the people what they want, good and hard. I'm curious why the neo before populism, and is it just to mean the latest populism, or because it seems it's different in any meaningful way?
That's a fun question. I think it is different. So there are a couple of good questions baked into that. So I agree with you completely that particularly critics of populism often describe it as something that offers simple answers to hard problems, right? You hear that a lot. You hear it a lot in Europe, where populism is in many ways stronger than it is, even stronger than it is in the U.S. Those populists will tell you if only you just do this, everything will be great. And there are ways in which that can be a fair critique of populism, but that can also be a fair critique of elite opinion, right? I mean, the notion that as long as we have free markets, we'll have prosperity and free people, boy, that's not exactly a nuanced argument, right?
This is a point I like to make. People say, oh, these populists, they don't think there are any trade-offs. And I would say, I don't know. It seems like the populists are ready to make some pretty serious trade-offs. It seems like the sort of, this is a win-win-win-win-win-win for everybody kind of Davos message is the softer one in that respect sometimes.
Yes, I absolutely agree, right? What are the trade-offs if what you're telling me is that your simple system leads to prosperity and freedom? So I think of populism in its root, and with many of these labels, there's both a capital letter version and a lowercase letter version. We're focusing on the lowercase letter version, not the populist party of the United States history. But obviously, there's some overlap there. Look, I think of populism as a political message that tries to prioritize the masses of people. I think the dangerous forms of it sometimes make that ethnically based. And I think the more productive forms of it focus on people who have fewer resources, right? Whatever country you're in, you'll use different phrases. But in this country, we tend to describe them as middle class and working class people. You're talking about the mass of people. And you basically have a set of policies that, but one, takes their opinions seriously and respects their opinions and tries to implement policies not that always immediately follow from their opinions, but don't reject their opinions. And I think one of the ways in which the Democratic Party has gotten into so much trouble on a set of issues like immigration is that the Democratic Party is large parts of it are just disdainful of most Americans' views of immigration. And I think a form of populism is not. Even if you don't subscribe to all those views, you at least respect them and think about how to craft a policy that takes them into account and that really tries to produce good and rising living standards for most people. And so that, to me, is a decent, very initial, broad definition of populism. And then the question of why the neo. So I do think, in part, it's just the neopopulism is a description that says this new version is not identical to the old version, just because the world isn't identical. So neopopulism has to have as its center responding to a rising China in a way that the history of populism does not. Neopopulism has to take into account technological change. When you, Oren, talk about which industries we really need to worry about because of their strategic importance, those are not industries that necessarily existed a few decades ago. And neopopulism also, and this is one thing I particularly like about it, yes, in a way, it's trying to just play off of neoliberalism. But that's not just a linguistic device. It is also the fact that the original populism was not a response to the failures of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism had not yet failed. But I'm not saying neoliberalism has failed in every way, because, look, it's delivered wonderfully rising incomes to much of the world. Neoliberalism has. But it has failed in a whole bunch of ways. And the neopopulism that you see in the United States, I think, is in part a response to the failures of neoliberalism in the United States.
Yeah, so I'm going to take the opportunity that you've also written a book about all this to switch you from your reporter hat to your author hat, and kind of curious for your opinion of some of this. Ours was the shining future. I think is a really thoughtful, in depth sort of narrative of this failure of neoliberalism. Where did it come from? What its consequences have been? And in a sense, therefore, where neopopulism comes from. I'm curious which parts of the neopopulist narrative you are therefore left sort of most or least sympathetic to. Like, what do you think it really gets right, and where would you say it's maybe populist in the not so in the not so useful senses?
Yes. So, and if at the risk of overgeneralization, I would say that the biggest risks are that today's Democratic Party, and generally the center-left parties in Europe as well, are not populist enough, and that's where the problem comes. And today's Republican Party and some of the far-right parties in Europe can become too populist. And so to start on the first one, look, Thomas Piketty and his co-authors have used this phrase, the Brahmin left, to describe the fact that left of center parties in many countries, including the United States, have increasingly come to reflect the views of relatively affluent, highly educated professionals. And I think that's a real problem, because I think the Democratic Party's history is, at its most glorious, is a history of defending people who have less. And that's not what the Brahmin left version of the Democratic Party is. And whether it's how disdainful the Democratic Party can be of Americans' opinions on immigration. And in fairness, some Democrats are not disdainful of it, but much of the party is, including in particularly people who have an outsized megaphone, right? So people on college campuses, people in the national media, people who work at think tanks, people who donate money to Democratic campaigns, they genuinely believe in much, much more open borders. And if you doubt that, I'm guessing many of your listeners don't, but if you doubt that, read the Democrats' 2020 campaign platform on immigration. There's nothing in it on border security. That is a rapid change for that party very quickly. The Democratic Party is also disdainful on mass opinion during parts of COVID and insisting on really long school shutdowns. Can also be disdainful of mass opinion on affirmative action, claiming that the reason it keeps losing in state after state, including California, is that somehow the ballot initiative wasn't framed right. I mean, come on, as if people are too stupid to read a ballot initiative and all these results don't make sense, and huge numbers of voters of color also voted against it. And so, to me, that is the problem with the parties of the left. The parties of the right, the problems with the parties of the right is they can go so far as it can become the autocratic version of populism, the cult of personality version of populism. It can say that it is an ethnically exclusive version of populism. And obviously, Donald Trump embodies many of those issues, while also, in an important way, causing the Republican Party to revisit some of its assumptions about neoliberalism.
The immigration issue, I think, is such a salient one, and sort of in some sense, it's a Rorschach test. It is both what people who will say the populists have gone totally overboard will focus in on, and it is what those who will say the populists have it right will focus on in some respects. I thought your work from your platform, and I think you had a piece in The Atlantic about it, or an adaptation on immigration, was really quite notable for sort of, while chastising some of the excesses on the right, validating a lot of this sort of core thesis, at least as a valid one to be taken seriously. I'm curious what your experience was in the reception to that. I think one place we've seen sometimes folks coming, or at least associated more with the left of center, for instance, coming out strongly for two-parent families, will find themselves bombarded in ways that are quite scarring sometimes. I think Melissa Kearney has a wonderful new book on that subject, and I think was maybe a little taken aback by who managed to be offended by it. I'm curious what, if anything, you learned about the immigration issue and the politics of it after having written about it as a result of sort of who it played well with, who was upset by it, kind of what people were willing to concede on versus really get their backs up about?
I'm not sure that an author is supposed to pick a favorite chapter, but I do think the immigration chapter might be my favorite chapter of the book. I also really like the one about A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader. But the immigration chapter is the one that I might have learned the most while writing. And in some ways, I think it's some of the freshest material in the book. I had to rely on transcripts of congressional hearings from the 60s. I had to rely on a really wonderful unpublished PhD dissertation and other sources that just people had not widely used before. And what I tried to tell in that was the story of how the immigration reformers, who were both Democrats and Republicans, but mostly Democrats, Teddy Kennedy, it was his first big piece of legislation that he managed in the Senate. LBJ was president. And I think they had very good intentions, and I found no piece of evidence that they secretly had different expectations from what they said publicly. I think they had very good intentions. They wanted to change this old system of immigration that the only really accurate word to describe it is racist. We said you could basically only come into this country if you're from Western Europe. And they wanted to change it to a system that didn't place any weight on where you came from. It instead placed weight on what job you had and other things. But they made a really big error, which is they repeatedly promised that it wouldn't lead to a large increase in the volume of immigration. And they were just completely wrong about that. And that's the story I tell, and I explain why they were wrong. And they were wrong almost immediately. I mean, the quotes are amazing to go back. They promised repeatedly, over and over again, members of LBJ's administration and members of the Senate, that the 1965 immigration bill would not lead to a meaningful increase in immigration. And of course, we know, with the benefit of nearly 60 years of history, that it transformed this country by leading to a massive increase in immigration. And I was nervous about what the reception to that chapter would be, and the Atlantic excerpted it, as you mentioned, although I prefer the longer version in the book, of course, as nice as the excerpt was. I was quite nervous about that. And part of it, from my personal experience, I became a little bit of a public figure during COVID for questioning the effectiveness and the wisdom of some of the COVID restrictions. In a way that I really never had been in my career before. New York Magazine profiled me, and the headline was, "Why are liberals so angry at David Leonhardt?" or roughly that. And so based on that experience, I thought, am I about to go through this all over again? I can take it. I've been through it. But, and actually, yes, it got some criticism of people who called me a restrictionist and this stuff. But for the most part, I really appreciated the debate. And, I think I've gone and talked about the book on 15 different college campuses, and I've had people who agree with me and disagree with me. But I actually found a lot of the debate respectful. And setting aside Gaza, which is a topic that has a rawness unlike anything else, setting that aside, I'm not making claims about the quality of debate about that. I think the quality of the debate around other issues in many places today is just better than it was in 2020 and 2021. I think we are past some of the peak accusatory personalization of debate in places that are predominantly on the left part of the political spectrum. I'm not saying it's gone. I'm not saying the state of free speech is fine on campuses. I'm just saying I don't think it's as bad as it was in my own personal experience debating a topic that was quite critical of major parts of modern progressivism and major parts of modern conservatism. My experience was quite rewarding.
That's great to hear. The next 6 months will surely put that observation to the test.
Fair.
But it's a good segue back to, I think from your reporting on the new centrism or the neopopulism. There are obviously a ton of different areas you mentioned, and that's one of the things that makes it so much fun doing what we do at American Compass. We are flipping from China to industrial policy to family policy to labor to it is the full menu. curious where you see the ground still seemed the most fertile in your reporting. It seemed like there's still more to come in some area.
You mean which policy areas can we get kind of a lot more? Yeah. So I think labor law reform is really important. I know you've thought about it in terms of how Republicans approach labor unions. And I think that's a very important area. I've thought about it a little bit more in terms of how Democrats approach it. And I think labor law reform is one of these things that Democrats keep saying they're in favor of and keep not actually doing. So it's the only major part of the Great Society that LBJ didn't pass, despite his famous ability to get Congress to do what he wants. It just wasn't a big priority for him. It's another story I tell in the book. And basically every Democratic president since him have said they're in favor of it and haven't done it. Jimmy Carter prioritized the Panama Canal Treaty instead of it. And so labor law reform in 2024 or 2025 or 2029 shouldn't look like it did in 1965. But we still fundamentally haven't tried a policy that makes it easier for workers to join labor unions when they want to join labor unions. And I know not all will, and that's okay. But the playing field is so uneven right now. I think that's an important area. And I think it's important for Republicans to think about what's a version of labor law reform and labor unions that they could actually get behind, because there's one version of that law change that just looks like Democrats do it when they have a trifecta and they don't really take Republican concerns in mind. And there's another version that looks more like the kind of infrastructure semiconductor bill that it does get some number of Republican votes. So on the left, I would probably say that I think labor law reform is the most important thing. I'm not saying it's the only important thing, but I think it's really important, and I think Democrats spend too little time. Labor law reform for Democrats tends to be and we're in favor of that too. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Those things don't happen, right? Policies happen when Joe Biden runs for office saying, I will pass climate funding. They happen when Barack Obama runs for office saying, I will pass healthcare reform. And labor law reform hasn't gotten to that. For Republicans, I think that Republicans on a lot of these issues, you are trying your best, Oren, to put meat on the bones. But I think for a lot of Republican legislators, they are still not comfortable actually leading on this kind of legislation. Some of them will vote for some Democratic bill, like on infrastructure. But, we really didn't see any meaningful legislation when Trump was president and Republicans held Congress, except a huge tax cut geared toward the wealthy. And so I guess what I'd like to know from the Republicans who you spend the most time talking to and who really seem to me to be genuinely interested in antitrust and corporate excess and families and communities and all these issues, I think it's great that they're so interested in this. I'd like to know, what kind of bills do you actually want to pass? How do you take your change in rhetoric and translate it into something that actually looks like policy that is A, genuinely conservative, and B, genuinely targeted at helping middle class and working class Americans, as opposed to Trump's tax cut, which is just the old stuff dressed up?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the $64,000 question on the right, and you start to see those, there's the Vance and the Hawley and the Rubio who could kind of, give you that stack of bills. But in terms of the sort of caucus as a whole, or even unity among those who are pushing the envelope, it can be very difficult to sort of make out the contours of what that might look like. It seems to me, I wonder if you agree with this, that a piece of that is that, particularly on some of these economic issues, conservatives in a sense have further to travel. That the neoliberalism was obviously an extremely bipartisan phenomenon, and yet at the same time there's sort of something uniquely Reagan about it, or some elements of it that on some of these issues like you just described, whether it's labor or industrial policy, the right seems to have further to travel. There are other issues. Immigration is an example where the left potentially has further to travel. But is that the dynamic you sense? And in reporting on it, to what extent do people say, like, yes, this is happening, but it's going to take longer, versus to what extent you still hear from people saying, oh, this is just a fringe thing, and the 2014 Republican Party is more likely to to be the one that emerges once again in the long run?
I don't think it's just a fringe thing. I mean, I should have said this before, but another reason I like the phrase neo-populist is the fact that many of these policies are popular, right? So it's not just that they're geared toward so many Americans, but many Americans favor them, right? I mean, Americans favor many forms of government. They're not socialists, but Americans favor many forms of government intervention to lower costs and create good jobs. They favor government action to reduce immigration. And so for that reason, I don't think it's just fringe. I think Donald Trump showed that this is where huge numbers of Republican voters are, and it's just not clear to me that there's an electoral path for a Nikki Haley, Jeb Bush, 1990s style Republican Party leader. So I don't think it's just a fringe thing. I also, and I agree with you completely that part of this is that the Republican Party has more distance to travel. Part of it is also the destructive aspect of Donald Trump, right? I mean, it's not as if Donald Trump is. But Bill Clinton was a figure who changed his party, but he did it through both really talented political skills, and he did it by releasing position papers. And Donald Trump owns this party. He runs this party. He's going to be the nominee for the third straight time. And that's obviously not the way he runs the party. And I think there's so much uncertainty about what would happen if he were president. How much would he try to compromise the independence of the judiciary? Questions like that I think that ends up crowding out a lot of these more substantive policy discussions. The good news is, it also allows those substantive policy discussions to take place, and maybe someday they can move more toward the center of the party when Trump is no longer its leading figure. Will that ever happen? Will Trump ever not be the?
Well, I think that's exactly right. Looking ahead, one interesting thing about Trump is that there is no sort of Trump heir in the sense that there's a world in which an extremely popular or liked by Trump vice president was everyone knew back on the ticket, and the presumptive 2028 and 2032 nominee, and sort of off you go. The reality is that while there are plenty of people trying to be like Trump, it tends to go quite poorly for them. And my conclusion is that there is no Trumpism. There is just Trump. And that if you do look then at what is coming next, it is the set of folks we're talking about, the neo-populists who are working on this stuff. I'm curious though, if we flip back to the left side, I guess there are two possible stories to be told about where the Democratic Party might be headed. One is they're waking up to these realities as well, starting to get more serious about some of the places where the sort of more Brahmin left is losing. The other story is that they're actually headed in the wrong direction, that if you sort of take seriously the idea of a realignment where you have a lot of working class voters of all races moving into the Republican Party, you have a lot of more highly educated upper middle class voters moving into the Democratic Party. The policies of each side therefore start to speak more to that constituency. There's almost a sort of reinforcing process where the Democratic Party would be expected to move even further in that sort of, in a sense, narrower and more elite niche. Would you call the fight one way or another at this point?
I like your framing of it, which maybe is my cop-out way of not calling the fight one way or the other, or my honest way of saying predictions are really hard. I think sometimes our role in the media is not to say this will happen, but to sketch out paths, right? Likely path. I really like your framing of it. So I absolutely can tell a story where the Democratic Party just struggles to do this, right? I mean, when you look at the energy on the left today, it really is around a set of things that people believe deeply in and that don't tend to be that popular, right? So, the maximal climate policies, the student protests on Gaza, the maximal school closures and Really, there was a large part of the kind of left expert class on science that wanted mask mandates in place basically forever, right? Certainly, there's nothing that's changed out in the world that would say they should come off after multiple years. Now, obviously, they just lost badly that argument. But on a bunch of the identity issues, right? The fact that as that California vote showed that like the Democratic Party has kind of lost Latinos and Asian Americans on affirmative action. And so I do think these are a set of genuinely held beliefs that people with a lot of access to megaphones and money and influence and institutional power in places like universities, or if you watch the Oscars, Hollywood. I really do think there are huge risks there for the Democratic Party. And this is a story that started in the 1960s with the rise of the New Left. So I think those are a big risk there. I think the more optimistic story for the Democratic Party would be there still has never been a party leader, with the possible exception of George McGovern, and we know how that turned out. There's never been a successful party leader who came from that part of the party. Joe Biden was clearly the least like that of anyone in 2020, even though he moved a long way toward it, right? He said, do I look like a socialist? That's why he got the nomination, because moderate voters in South Carolina, overwhelmingly black moderate voters in South Carolina, said, that's the guy who can beat Trump, not these other lefties. You go back, Patrick Ruffini does a lovely job of this in his Party of the People book. You go back and you read what Barack Obama said during his rise. My goodness, is it moderate and patriotic and even culturally conservative. And so I do think the Democratic Party has often been good at figuring out ways to let the figures who get where the American majority actually is rise to the top of the party. And I do think we've passed the moment of peak leftness, or if you prefer it, peak wokeness from 2020 and 2021. But I genuinely don't know how this turns out for the Democratic Party. And I absolutely agree with you that the party has a set of views on a whole bunch of social issues that it both will have a very hard time moderating, and that is not where the country is. And if anything, the reckoning has been delayed because the Republican Party has gotten so far out of step with the country on abortion that that's where so much of the attention has gone.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That on both sides really is if you look at what the election is being fought over, right, or what the consultants on each side want to fight the election over, it's almost none of the stuff that you talk about as the actual areas of. And I guess part of the reason is because if it's the stuff people agree on, then what are you fighting about? But even among the areas of disagreement, there are places where both sides are sufficiently out of step that everyone is vulnerable, I guess.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest mistakes Democrats make, and I hear a version of this a lot from people on the left, is they take an issue where public opinion is actually on the Republican side, and they say they, meaning Republicans, just do that to motivate their base, right? They just talk about immigration because it motivates their base. No. I get that immigration motivates the Republican base, but the problem with that sentence is the word just, right? Public opinion is squarely on the side of the Republicans when it comes to immigration. And if Democrats pretend otherwise, it's self-defeating for the Democratic Party.
It makes sense to me. Eddie, what are you working on next? Do we get any sneak preview? Just something you're thinking about?
That's a good question. So I am really interested in immigration. I do want to try to explain why we are living in this age of mass migration, not only in the United States, but in many other countries in the world. I don't think it's because there's more misery and oppression in the world than there ever used to be. We've actually just come out of a period where global poverty has fallen and where global deaths from violence have fallen, and yet we have the surge in migration. I think that's a really interesting question. I would also say that that I've long been interested in higher education, and some of the most enjoyable work I've done. I wrote a long piece in the Times about the SAT called "The Misguided War on the SAT," and so I often go looking for ideas in higher education. But I'm available on Twitter, so send me a DM, anyone, and I take assignments and suggestions. If your listeners have ideas of things that I should be writing about, I'd love to hear them.
Terrific. Well, those both sound good to me, so I will leave you to those. David Leonhardt, author of Ours Was the Shining Future, one of the best books I think that has been written on the failure of neoliberalism, and just wrote this weekend in the New York Times, A New Centrism is Rising in Washington. David, thank you so much for making the time today.
Oren, thanks for having me.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.